Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade, and my guest today is Brendan. Welcome, Brendan. I'm so glad you're here.
Hey there, thanks for having me, Cade. I'm Brendan Hagan, a 33-year-old software developer from Atlanta, Georgia.
I got to connect some with your Kuleshov Cube as we were looking at some cubes for KubeCon voting and seeing some of what you've been doing with that project, and excited to unpack some of that project together here.
Absolutely, yeah. I actually have two cubes entered in KubeCon this year, that and a peasant cube, and so trying to get all flavors in there.
Covering all the bases. One of the other things that you're into that I think we share some common interest in is old school and pre-modern. I saw you post a couple of deck photos, and I have to tell you up front, Brendan, that I think living plain plus Triskelion is a mean thing to do to other people.
Yeah, I tend to stick away from old school. I find it to be a kind of stale environment, but when I do play, which is maybe twice a year with some friends of mine at a bar, that's the kind of thing I like to do. Is something that's a little bit off the beaten trail and can lead to some good stories. The pre-modern side, though, I do enjoy a lot more, so I'll play that locally more often. It's a good era to kind of explore.
Well, I think that'd be a fair place to jump in then. How did you find your way to Cube? I know it sounds like you've covered a lot of ground.
Sure, so I started playing in 2008 with the Eventide pre-release. A couple of friends of mine kind of just said, we saw this thing was going to happen, and we used to play. Do you want to come? And so they taught me real quick, and we went ahead and attended. From there, I kind of got the bug and played a lot of limited and standard. Experimented with modern when it first came out in 2011, and then gravitated towards legacy in 2012 when GP Atlanta came through. At the time, when we had a pretty healthy legacy scene, and so that was enough to kind of sustain a weekly kind of occurrence. And we had the Star City circuit, we had locals, we had 5Ks and different quarterly events, and so it was a good, healthy experience.
What were you playing mostly in Legacy?
Early on, I played a lot of Maverick, just green-white
Yeah.
kind of Stoneforge-based Mother of Ruins kind of experience. Really, really good deck, and I really enjoyed that was kind of a thing that you could do despite all the power that the format kind of provided. But as power creep kind of came in, you get into your true names and your terminuses. I started to get to the more unfair green cards and played a lot more elves. And so, the later half of 2015 to 2018, when I still played a lot, elves would be the prominent deck.
Still like let's see, it would be natural order into Progenitus sort of stuff.
Yeah. Craterhoof came out by that point in time with Avacyn Restored, and so you did have a good kill. But I got a little frustrated with essentially just playing Night of the Reliquaries at a 10-10 and that not being really respectable in the format anymore. And
Yeah.
so,
Isn't that wild when you can do that and your opponent just kind of shrugs and moves past it?
I fought it as long as I could. We dug pretty deep on playing cards like Rogue's Passage and Behemoth Sledge to try and get through Lingering Souls, and it became kind of a losing battle. The format got a little bit more unfair, a little bit quicker, and you kind of just had to do something over the top. But going back to Cube here, I started first introduced to Cube back in 2010 when I was in college at Virginia Tech through a friend of a friend, and kind of just had a bit of draft experience there. But I started to build my own in 2011. At the time, I started with a powered cube based off of White Wolf 123's kind of stock list at the time as one of the big names in the scene. Found, though, that I wasn't a huge fan of the powered play pattern. I think when you're the one that kind of owns it and kind of brings it out, you kind of see the same things over and over again. So while it was, at the time, at least it was novel for everyone else, it was getting a little bit repetitive for me. And so I started to depower it, started to change it up, and then eventually just settled on Peasant in about 2013 as kind of my preferred default cube experience. And I've been curating that ever since.
So the same cube now for over a decade.
Correct, yeah. And it's had, multiple incarnations. It's grown in size and shrunk in size and had themes come and go, had archetypes kind of vanish. But there's still pieces of the same cube there.
That's pretty amazing to have that kind of legacy and a through line on something like that.
Absolutely. And, it evolves, as all things do. And I've had someone describe it to me as it kind of has a historical presence to it, where you can kind of still see some of the key cards from back in 2015 and 2016 era. And so I hope that's kind of a thing you can kind of highlight out of it, is that it's not quite the same as everyone else's Peasant Cube list, despite there being 8 in the current voting pool on CubeCon.
Yeah, and I know Peasant is a broad umbrella to try and unpack, but how did you land for that project on uncommons and down as a design thing, especially since so much of your constructed experience would have been with rares and up?
Yeah, it just was kind of the power level I wanted, and it more closely to me at least replicated what you would expect in a limited environment. Because when I first got into the game, I was the broke high school kid that didn't want to pay money for a standard deck, and so
Yeah.
I did a lot of draft because it was $5 more than playing the constructed event at that point in time. So why would I play constructed for $5 and just go 0-2 or 0-4 when I could put my $10 towards a draft and actually have a good chance with that and make some money back.
And you got to keep the cards. Like you were building toward a collection too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that could, for a whole high school kid with no job, that could circle back in and pay for next week. And so that was kind of nice. So I really enjoyed limited as a basic concept. And as I mentioned, the powered cube kind of didn't give me that. It gave you a very different experience, which was fine for some people and not a huge thing that I really enjoyed. But with peasants, at least, you still got your card evaluations to be kind of similar to what you would expect from a normal draft environment.
In what ways have you seen the game change over that time? Like, maybe through the lens of Cube, like what have you seen as some of the big shifts?
For me, the biggest thing and the kind of thing I have a lot of problems with is that the definition of what constitutes a good creature has changed so dramatically. When I first started, you could still play like a vanilla creature, and you could be excited about having a decently statted creature that didn't have 8 other lines of text to give you immediate value. But now it feels like everything needs to pass the Jace test. You can't just put your Baneslayer in play and have it bounce play a Jace. You need to have a creature that comes into play and it gains you life, it draws you cards, it recoups value immediately, it creates multiple permanents or game objects, and the game has kind of just spiraled towards that, where your creatures are effectively what spells used to be.
That's I've not heard the term the Jace test, but I love that as a metric.
That was the thing in standard back in 2010, 2011 or something like that with World Wake.
Yeah, because you had Jace that could -1 to return a creature.
Right, so if
Really?
you were just playing a vanilla creature and a Jace came down, you could unsummon it 3 times in a row. You weren't really playing the game.
Yeah. And that's so funny to think that even like Jace the Mind Sculptor has found its way out of some environments for not being able to hang anymore, which is
It's
strange.
baffling to me. Yeah, it's and that kind of I think speaks to the creature quality is that an unsummon is not a good thing anymore because you're just giving them another spell in their hand
Right, right. How many things have ETBs or cast triggers?
or generate 5 tokens or
That's
if you're
true.
not getting a 3 for 1 out of your card, you're kind of losing rate nowadays. I've tried to curate that back into my cubes. I think whenever possible is that I want you to feel okay with casting a card and maybe not getting immediate value if it pays off later or it gives you something else to do.
Is that like an explicit goal that you set out for in your projects, or do you think it's just a product of your sensibilities?
I think it's more of a sensibility thing. It's kind of the game that I like to curate and the game that I like to play, and so I would hope that I can retain some of it even through all the new card designs, and hopefully that vision kind of pulls itself through.
Well, Brendan, you mentioned that you enjoyed limited early on, and it sounds like you still do. I think at the time of recording, I saw you post that you just completed draft number 45 of the year, and we're right about halfway through the year. That's pretty extensive draft experience.
Yeah, and I'll highlight that that's only paper drafts. I don't enjoy playing online. I work on computer all day long, and I can't really do that for entertainment. So the only draft and only actual Magic I get anymore really is Cube and kind of with friends and with travel groups, that kind of thing.
That's awesome. And what a cool opportunity to get to draft that frequently.
Absolutely, and there's been good variety too. I think I've done 24 or 5 different cubes in that time, and so get to explore it, a bunch of different ideas and whatever else thinks is a good environment.
Yeah, and we'll get to see some of specifically how that impacts the Kuleshov Cube here. But like broadly, how do you think your extensive drafting experience has impacted how you approach cube design?
Well, I think I let other people curate the cubes that I might not want to build myself, and I think I'm okay with that. So I will still get my powered cube draft or my unpowered cube draft or my more standard kind of style of cube every now and again, and that's infrequent enough. And I'm letting someone else kind of have the visibility of that every time it's been drafted. And so even though it's not my personal flavor, I still get to experience it and get to enjoy it, but I can do it less frequently than if I owned it myself.
I like that, let other people enjoy certain things that you might not pick.
And if they're going to enjoy curating it and actually looking at cards through that lens, then all power to them, and that's something that I think is good for me.
Do you think playing or having opportunity to play that frequently impacts how you design also? Like, does it change how you're able to put projects together?
Yeah, and I think that goes back in history too. When I was playing constructed formats more regularly, like on a weekly basis or even bi-weekly, you got less opportunities to cube because it just came up less. You might cube once a month, and if you're going to cube once a month, you want it to be a very stable environment that you know is going to perform, and you know is going to be something that people can kind of understand and gravitate towards. But now that I'm not doing that and I'm cubing more frequently, I think I can go into different directions and kind of explore other territories because you don't need every draft to be, you know, the slam dunk once a month event.
That's really interesting.
It's just kind of a change in the way that I think about cubes and the way that I think the people around me do as well. Is that the cube has no longer become just that default thing of the most powerful cards that fit, you know, this certain style. I think we've all experienced that enough. We've all had it enough, and we've kind of said, what else can we do? And so it's been fun to explore, especially the last few years. And I think KubeCon especially has really increased the visibility to those kind of things and kind of given the broad appeal of what Cube can really do as a custom draft format.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the glowing values of an event like that. The number of people that have attended and then left inspired to go a completely different direction than they've considered before.
Yeah, and it's gotten to the point where I can cube with people that maybe are not familiar with Cube or haven't cubed before, and have them not just default to it being the Moto Cube as the only way that you can build a cube.
Right, right. That cube doesn't explicitly mean just one thing.
Correct, and that's been really rewarding to have that as a starting point for discussions.
Well, let's dive into the Kuleshov cube here a little bit. I think there's some really cool things you've done with this project. And speaking of KubeCon, one that you've prepared to submit for that event, would you give us the overview for this project?
Yeah, so the Kuleshov Cube is a 360 card, medium power level ish cube featuring some prominent enchantment graveyard themes. The cube forgoes red cards, and it features minimal tokens and minimal counters. The name originally started as In Search of Meaning, which I later realized is a terrible thing to discuss and a terrible thing to say because you basically cannot say it in any context. When the cube got selected for Capital Cube Champs later this year, I realized it was going to come up in discussions, and I said, "This is not going to work." So I rebranded it to the Kuleshov Cube, which I think is probably unique enough, or hopefully interesting enough to kind of spark some interest.
Yeah, and I imagine something like search for or in search
In
of
Search of
meaning
Meaning.
is the sort of thing you have to imagine yourself with a pipe and a bathrobe, sort of, pontificating about, I suppose.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to a habit of mine is that when I'm kind of just tinkering on a cube cover and just piling lists together, I kind of just put the first thing that comes to mind with no intention of everyone ever seeing it or saying it. um, and so that cube originally kind of spawned from a 2024 idea called an exercise in patience, which was kind of the same thing where you would probably never say that in person.
I love it. So we've gone from exercise and patience to in search of meaning, and now we're on the Kuleshov cube. And I got to learn a lot about this one. I did some research based on really the experiment, I suppose. Do you want to talk a bit about what the Kuleshov effect is and how that pertains to what you're doing here?
Yeah, so the name comes from the Kuleshov effect, which is a film concept proposed by Lev Kuleshov in the 1920s. His posit is that essentially more meaning can be derived from the interaction of two shots in film than either in isolation. His original demonstration was essentially just intercut footage of a blank expression on a man with various things like a bowl of soup, a girl in a coffin, a woman lounging on a couch. The idea being that the viewer then has to read meaning into the face and then kind of determine what the guy is thinking or expressing based on the shot that we just saw. The effect itself is a little dated now, maybe. I think with 100 years of film experience, we as an audience are kind of more attuned to this kind of thing inherently, and so it doesn't do the same thing it used to. But the concept is very fundamental to film, I think, and even more modern demonstrations, you can look at maybe Peppy style live TV where we're creating meaning or we're creating associations that might not exist. This is your standard, Big Brother TV show, right, where they can make anyone look like they're fighting just based on how they're going to arrange the shots.
Yeah, like you're intercutting different things.
The editor, as a person that actually is constructing and assembling this film, can really create anything they want to, right? They can make someone who's totally tame and benign look really mean and angry, and it's just a matter of how you present it. And that's kind of what the Kuleshov effect proposes and has evolved into.
I remember a YouTube video some years ago where a group cut the Home Alone trailer into a horror film.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
because like you could just take each of those scenes and with the right, I don't know, underscore and the right sequence of text or of talk, it sounds like something completely different.
If you time it right, you cut it differently, you can repurpose any kind of footage you want, and that's kind of the purpose of the Kuleshov effects. Lev Kuleshov was more interested in kind of the mechanics of film and kind of how, as a construction and as a medium, you could kind of create things. His whole point was that you don't really need the actors. You don't need the actors to do certain things. You can create things for them.
So then, what? How do you apply that here to this environment?
Yeah, and so my idea originally with In Search of Meaning was I kind of wanted to try and find the meaning in current modern sets. um, recover the magic essentially from magic sets. And I think that's kind of evolved more into can we expose kind of the interaction of cards and kind of recontextualize cards based on what else you can find in a draft. So a card in isolation might be one thing, but if you pair it with something else, does it create some kind of interesting draft in a draft deck or some interesting kind of interaction?
So, what sort of things do you look for to try to, I don't know, find those hooks for to see how things connect?
Yeah, I think there's traditional ways that we kind of expect to play cards, and I'm hoping to try and subvert that a little bit. Maybe all your discard outlets don't have to be just for card value and card advantage, and hopefully you can do something else with it. And I think that's kind of the idea, at least.
Well, you said you started around Eventide, so in an era where most cards didn't have everything packaged all together. There was often a cost to an effect that you had to subvert some other way, or you had to pay for some other way.
Yeah, you can turn your downsides into upsides, and hopefully, if you just play a mediocre card but you pair it with something else, you can make it a little more exciting. And so hopefully that recontextualizes your drafts, recontextualizes your games, just to try and do something more interesting along the way.
So to make sure we catch a couple of the things that are unique to this cube, you mentioned you have basically eschewed red entirely. What led to that decision?
When I originally started adding cards for the cube, I did intend to have some amount of red in there, possibly color imbalanced, but I was struggling to find a way for red to do something that bridged well with the other colors we're trying to accomplish. Red for me has always felt like it engages more with artifacts. You have your welders and you have your braids, and it's good at using artifacts and destroying artifacts, but it doesn't really do well with enchantments. And I was having a hard time finding anything that discard wise it could do that wasn't just welder stuff or madness style delirium things that we already could do in other colors, and I wasn't really finding anything interesting there. So I made the ultimate decision kind of to promote everything else in absence of red and see what I could do there. And that means your aggressive colors are a little different, and what your requirements are for a removal spell kind of change as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say you lose out on things like direct damage, maybe, or like you noted, artifact removal is something that red is usually pretty good at.
Yeah, and so the cube does forgo a lot of artifacts. It doesn't really try to engage on that, and I didn't want to kind of dilute the other themes by adding more artifacts to support red.
I will say it tickles me that you do have one red card in here.
One and a half. Let's go with that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we have our one nabob, Squee, the goblin nabob, who is almost never cast in any environment. And then
Yeah,
I think it's
absolutely.
push pull. Is that the hybrid one that has your other red?
We'll call that a half because I've gotten call in it twice where someone will go, "You said no red cards," and the card is technically red despite being hybrid.
But you noted with kind of making these decisions about colors, did you start with that idea of really wanting to focus on graveyard and enchantments, or was that something that came from pursuing other ends?
Yeah, going back to that 2024 exercise in patience, I had kind of just assembled a bunch of ideas. And the ones that kind of stuck out were the ones that were enchantment and graveyard based. And those are the ones I kind of wanted to explore deeper. And so that was from the onset kind of the starting point, at least. I think it's evolved a little since then. And I think there's a couple more things to do now where it's self bounce, some self discard and mill, tapping matters. When you get into enchantments, you can divert that into auras. And then that kind of leads into equipment as well. And then just various explorations of like threshold and delirium kind of come naturally with things you can do off the graveyard.
You noted shying away from a powered cube, certainly, but how do you think about power level in an environment like this that's covering a broad spectrum of archetypes that historically have had very different power levels to them?
Yeah, when I kind of look at things, I try and find a tentpole card that I want to make potentially playable, or at least kind of the benchmark for what should be a good card or an average card. And if I want you to play Riptide Chimera, for example, as a 3/4 that bounces enchantments, I mean, I want to give you time to potentially use that. It's a pretty aggressive card. It can hit, but ideally the cube should promote you to do other things where you're overspending your mana multiple times on the same effect and feel encouraged or comfortable with doing that. So that kind of dictates where the power level needs to be. Is if I want certain effects to still be playable, I need the format to be tempered enough to kind of support that.
There are a couple of cards that some people may think of as the on the outside edge of power. I'm thinking about something like Earthcraft jumps to the front of mind for me. Just other things in that family. I imagine those are all to point toward specific archetypes or themes that you're aiming for, though.
Yeah, and I hope with a card like Earthcraft, for example, I mean, you can do other things with it besides just go wide off your creatures or something like that.
Right.
If it gives you the time to kind of activate other abilities or something like that, then hopefully that's more interesting. The cube also, with its kind of minimal tokens, doesn't go as absurd, I think, as some other cubes can with Earthcraft. And so the idea with cards like that is that hopefully they're not as power outlier-y as they might be in other cubes. So even powerful removal, like a damnation, I don't think is potentially at its best when half your opponents will be playing permanent-based non-creature spells.
When it sounds like cards like that, and I don't mean to just single out something like Earthcraft, but
Oh
it
no,
sounds like cards
absolutely.
like that are really leaning toward not necessarily combo as much as just like an angle of value that you can pursue.
Yeah, and I've overcorrected in the wrong way in the past, where I've cut too many power outliers, where there's a very homogenous kind of way to play the game, and that doesn't have a good experience either. And so I've learned over the last couple of years, at least, that you kind of do need to have something at least that is explosive and makes your deck want to focus on this one card or this one effect, because it creates multiple more decks you can build in the cube and multiple more ways you can draft it than just having the standard homogenous pile of good cards.
Yeah, and boy, there's been a lot of ink spilled on that topic too. Of like, how much do you sand down before it's just a polished square that is not interesting versus just something that has a little bit of texture to it that's going to draw drafters and players in different directions.
Yeah, and I for a while there, I was experimenting with a four-player cube of 180 cards, and the problem I was having was that it's so narrow that you end up just drafting on rails where
Mm,
your two drop and your three drop are going to be one of these two options every game,
yeah.
and the games all kind of become samey, which means that the effects become the same too, where you're seeing the same interactions over and over again.
Well, and you noted that that was something that you were not wanting to experience, right? Coming from a powered cube environment where it's like, here are the top ends and it's going to look the same in many experiences.
Yeah, and so with this cube especially, I've tried to be more package based, where there's maybe four or five cards that really interact well together, and if you get three of them or two or three of them, that can be a thing your deck can do that might shift you from a more standard archetype.
You mentioned also restricting things like tokens, like counters. I think you explicitly choose to not include plus one counters. So we're not quite in the bar cube sensibility where we're pretty close to that. What guided you that direction?
Yeah, so there's a great series of blog posts by Andy Gavin, the co-founder of video game development studio Naughty Dog, about the creation of Crash Bandicoot, and some of the challenges they faced kind of when they were trying to tackle one of the early platforming games in 3D. And what they found is that when you added these extra dimensions, like the third dimension, you kind of had to take away other dimensions to create more dense pockets of gameplay. And so they experimented with removing time as a constraint you could control, right? They're going to force you to run. They experimented with removing the boundaries of how far you can move horizontally to try and rail you into certain interactions with enemies. And I found that to be kind of interesting from a soft constraint perspective, where maybe if you do impose soft constraints or hard constraints on a cube, you can kind of explore more deeply what you have left. And so by eschewing, red and by getting rid of some of the tokens and other things that you kind of normally expect to see in these slots, and the ways you can kind of build a board, are there other ways you can explore kind of what makes a good permanent or what makes a good card?
Yeah, it kind of, I don't know if recontextualize is too strong a word there, but it certainly makes you think of each card differently when you know, hey, my opponent's not just going to flood out the board with a, secure the wastes or whatever.
Yeah, and the counter thing specifically is that I don't particularly like messy board states where it's hard to track what is what. And so by
Yeah.
getting rid of plus one counters, you can kind of introduce named counters like stun counters and shield counters, and that makes me feel more confident that those are going to be legible on a board state.
Yeah. I mean, that was a decision I made in the counters focus cube that I keep, though I went the other way. So I determined it was going to be all plus one counters. And so that you didn't have to guess, wait, is this a shield counter or is this a whatever else?
Yeah, and I'm gonna probably explore solving that another way, anyways, too, by adding my own custom printed tokens essentially that can mark the counters. But I think it's one of those things that I just want to consider when building is that I don't like messy boards and I don't like confusing boards, and I know I get frustrated personally when I see something that's going to introduce some external tracking object that I have to go figure out how to mark down.
So you're telling me you're not including the initiative here?
There is no initiative, no monarch, no ring bearers, no dungeons. I've had no meaningfully positive interactions with those kind of things in the past in cube environments, and I drafted I think a one drop cube a couple months ago where all of a sudden I had Frodo coming down and trying to give me the ring, and I was like, "Oh, do you have a ring token? Do you have a ring counter? Can I mark this somehow?"
Because that all came with like particular pieces in the packs that you're supposed to use, but you're tracking an object that has 4 different states that can impact. There's a lot to work with there.
We ended up with 2 cell phones on the board to track 2 different things. One was a dungeon, one was a ring thing, and we both didn't know the abilities very well, and so I just don't particularly like those kind of boards, and so I kind of tried to avoid them. And I think with the Kuleshov, at least, removing the plus 1 counters was a nice way to explore the other kinds of counters that you can offer in the game, which I hadn't really explored before.
And you also mentioned custom printed tokens. Is that for this project or for other projects?
I haven't done it yet, but I have the template of what I kind of want with that. But I think that might be the way I want to try and solve it, is just having a piece of paper, or a custom printed token that just has the word stun counter on it, right? That way you can very, very visibly know what it is.
No, that makes sense.
Which is something I'm surprised WotC didn't really do. They just gave us those little punch out tokens instead, which for something like a shield, right? Shield actually has reminder text and it has clauses on when it actually happens,
That's right.
which I
That's right.
went over with last week actually with my draft group. And so I'd rather just put that on the card explicitly.
This reminds me of Star Wars Unlimited, that in each set they will only produce 2 types of tokens so that they can print a single double-sided card in each expansion pack that covers both of those, exactly like you described, that it has reminder text and it has like, oh, that's what this token does and that's what this token does, and then nothing else, so you don't have to worry about what's what.
I played that game for the first set and I really enjoyed that it was so constrained, but I haven't followed it since actually. But it's good to hear that they've intentionally limited themselves for now, at least, to try and make things legible.
Yeah, do you think of the Kuleshov Cube as one that's designed with accessibility in mind? Like, are you trying to lean into like the player experience there, or do you think that's just kind of come about by how you've put it together?
I think in terms of game objects, it's come about just by kind of my own personal preferences and tastes. But I would like to think at least that the draft experience is approachable. From you just take a card and hopefully it's not a dead end, right? There's no misleading signals ideally. I think the power level on what you should draft might be something you need to learn on second draft or third draft. But with luck, at least, you're not going to get pigeonholed into the wrong archetype where you can't find something you want or something you need to do. So in that respect, I hope that's approachable or accessible.
Well, as you noted, that you get to draft with some frequency, and I imagine this cube finds its way into the rotation pretty regularly. So you probably get to see how players respond to that, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The one problem I do have is that we tend to only get 4 to 6 people, and so I've only gotten a handful of 8-person drafts with this cube, and so you have trouble finding the ratio of what cards and what effects you want to include with fewer than 8 people. When something is absent at a 4-player draft, you can't really tell if that's because the draft was biased or the card pool was biased, or it's a bit hard to kind of judge.
I did want to ask, just based on a couple pictures that I've seen posted, are there particular aesthetic decisions you've made for this environment? Like, I noticed your basic lands were some of my very favorites, like the Mirage ones. Are you aiming for any particular consistent aesthetic across your project?
Well, I have a thing, I guess, where I only like original printings. I don't want promos or alternate frames or art. And that goes back to the legibility thing, is that I personally, at least, find to be the most legible the original printing, where it's a very consistent point in time where you can tell that this card was made and kind of what effects it's going to have. And I don't track very well a lot of the secret layers or new promo releases, and so I'm always surprised when I see a card that I don't recognize, and it happens to be some card I knew from 2010. So in
Yeah.
that regard, I do like the original printings, and I do keep that as a kind of a rule throughout my cubes. For basics in this cube, I went with Mirage just because I don't really have an outlet for them otherwise. I haven't used them before, and so it was a nice place to kind of try that. I've generally leaned towards more like Invasion Odyssey, kind of older border cards before, and so going further back to Mirage was kind of a nice little touch.
Oh, I love that. Well, and it looks like also for your peasant cube, you've pursued signatures on a lot of those too.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about you have a kid, I guess, and you don't have a lot of time to kind of play as much, and you've gotten into more podcasting. For me, that kind of turned into when I got a job in 2015 that required a lot of travel. I didn't have a lot of time to play, and so I got more interested in the signature part of things. It was a way to keep me interacting with the game that didn't require me actually playing it. And so between 2014, 2015-ish, and now I've kind of been collecting signatures for that cube, and that's evolved over the time to the point now where I think it's still about 75 or 80% signed.
That's so cool.
As I say, it's a personal choice of mine. I think the aesthetic is probably not something that all people like, and I know I've had some drafters that are confused by illegible text because of the signature obscuring it. So I don't do it on newer cubes, and I probably won't do it again given the chance, but I do like the way it looks for that cube.
Well, Brendan, I did want to ask because you've been really strikingly specific about the dates over the years. Like it sounds like you have just a really good record or memory of your experience with the game. Is that something that extends to other parts of life for you? Or is that kind of like specific to Magic?
Yeah, I wrote it all down. um, no, I mean, the major dates about when I started playing things or when cubes were built, I mean, are kind of just ingrained. You kind of just know roughly based on what set was out and what kind of area you're in. It also, for me, is a lot of it's based on life events. I know when I was in Virginia, when I was in Atlanta, when I was traveling in Kansas City, and when I was in DC. And so you kind of mark things based on the era that they were in. We mentioned earlier that I have 45 drafts on log, and I kind of just do that as a personal practice where I kind of like to keep track of things. And it's been fun to kind of log my cube drafts as kind of an achievement and a way to kind of measure myself to see what I'm drafting and if I'm drafting colors equally or different cues too frequently. And it's nice to kind of have that as a record.
Yeah, and not just a note that you have made this draft, but it sounds like deck photos and you've done some analysis of that. You have deck photos going back quite a ways, right?
Yeah, I think if I dug through my old phones and kind of poked around, I probably have deck photos back to, I don't know, 2015 or beyond. I still actually have linked on my Peasant Cube the original MTG Salvation post I have.
Wow,
Which
that's
is
so cool.
such a dead website now, but I had deck photos even then, and that goes back into like late 2015, where I pulled it up right now. I have a draft from October 26th of 2015 where I have all 4 decks from a 4-person draft. It's fun to kind of see, I guess, the evolution of the cube and kind of where we were at in our drafting knowledge and kind of what we thought was a good card.
Yeah, like, what a powerful memento. And it's not the sort of thing that you can recreate from scratch either. Like it's just a product of your diligence over a decade.
I just find it to be fun. I like to kind of track on when things happen and what I was doing at the time. A lot of that comes with memories. It's a lot of events with people that I don't see a lot anymore or that don't play, and so it's good to have that kind of record.
I love that. That's really cool.
Of course, it also has the side effect of showing how bad of a drafter I was at certain times.
We're all learning, right?
Fortunately, I don't think I bias. I don't think I intentionally exclude my O3s, but
That's right. Yeah, the records were lost. I've destroyed the tapes.
they're there on display for all to see. Yeah, absolutely. That is something I will say, though, is that when I started tracking it, the more I noticed that I don't actually finish multiple rounds of drafts usually. I think with my group specifically, and my current group now for sure, we generally know enough about our deck after the first or second round to know if we still want to play it, or I think we generally prefer the draft process and we'd rather go draft some other cube instead, and so we don't necessarily finish all 3 rounds of a typical draft.
That's interesting. I know I've heard different people suggest like, oh, the draft part is the fun part, and I would just draft again, like compare decks and go again. But it sounds like you actually could do that.
I think we do maybe take that to extreme. I think we are comfortable with knowing that the deck functions after playing a game or two, and that's generally good enough to know if you achieve what you wanted out of the draft.
Brendan, one of the things that you mentioned as we were kind of pre-show talking a little bit was about proxies, and particularly how that related to some of your early cube projects and where that's brought us to now. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Well, I think back in 2011 when I first built my first vintage cube, or powered cube rather, I mean, that was heavily paper proxied, where it was just printouts. And while it was ugly, it was something that would actually let me kind of jumpstart getting a cube draft going, with the intention then of filling it out with real cards.
Yeah, you're 1 year into the game. You're probably not going to buy a full set of power.
Yeah, at the time, I think it was closer to 3 years into the game, but it was still way too early for me to really want to consider putting all these expensive cards into a cube. Although I did have a fair bit at that point in time relative to probably what I should have had. But for me, I don't think proxies became normalized until COVID, 2019. That was when everything kind of shut down. We weren't playing Magic in a constructed, sanctioned environment anyways, and so I played a lot of webcam games with friends of mine, and printing out your deck and just playing it was the way to do things because you could be more creative. We create a lot of variant formats. We would make up a format and then play it the next week, and then it was more fun to do it that way than it was to kind of constrain ourselves based on what we already had. And so I think once that kind of crept in, the floodgates were open. And now with the advent of kind of printed proxies that are more close to the card stock of real cards, and having things that actually look presentable in a sleeve has kind of really elevated what you can do. Going back as well, I mentioned that I think most people prior to probably 2015 or so would have thought that a very typical cube had to be kind of built because you wanted to kind of own all the cards and had to kind of put your time into it and your money into it. And I think that's kind of changed in recent years where you can have the flexibility now to just build something ad hoc, and I can scrap it together, put an order in, and have it the next week. And that's a very different freedom essentially for just building and exploring cubes that you might otherwise not build.
So then using it not just like for testing necessarily, but for actually being able to explore projects that would otherwise be, how would you say, outside of the bounds of what may be possible.
Well, not even what might possible, what you might want to put your money up to do.
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
and I'm at the point in my life where I make a fine sum of money and I could afford these things, and I do own my own power and that kind of stuff. But I don't necessarily want to own multiple copies of it, or I don't want to buy the $60 chase card of the new standard set if I don't have to. And so if it's not a stable project that I'm going to keep together forever, then I don't feel obligated to kind of engage with official WotC product in that way.
And it sounds like if it's of interest or if it's something that is meaningful enough over time that it's something you could pursue if you wanted. But if you're just learning, if you're just testing, if you're just exploring, that there's another avenue to that.
Yeah, if I just want to build something that I saw online, right, a neat cube deck I saw, or a neat cube rather I saw online, then I can scrap together pretty quickly, pretty cheaply, and then see if I like it, and then from there decide if I actually want to pursue assembling it properly. And with friends of mine as well, that's been kind of eye-opening, right? People that before I think would never have considered building a cube, I think are now doing so because they can do it for a lot less money. Even just getting the 100 most expensive cards out of a powered cube is going to give you a pretty reasonable starting point.
Yeah, and there's something I've heard other friends on other podcasts talk about Cube as being kind of arguably countercultural in a way, where it's like you don't always have to do the corporate thing. That if you're able to engage with the game in a way that is accessible to you, that doesn't cost you everything, like that you can still do the thing you enjoy without paying out too much for it.
Yeah, and I can definitely track my cube interests as kind of a counterculture kind of thing as well, where I was very much a legacy player up until maybe 2017, 2018, when support kind of dwindled and the way that the format was curated kind of changed. When I had weeklies to go to and I had travel events to go to and I was attending a Eternal Weekend every year, I didn't need to cube as much because I was still getting that magic outlet, and I didn't have time to play 5 times a week, right? But
Yeah.
when I was playing, it was constructed formats. And so as my attachment to the sanctioned official way to play the game dwindled, right, my interest in cube advanced. And so if we're already going to be breaking the rules and we're not going to be playing the way that WotC necessarily supports, then I don't feel obligated to follow all of their rules.
That tracks.
We mentioned pre-modern at some point as well, and that happened in Lambda where we, even prior to like the 2018 death rate ban in Legacy was already declining, and we kind of made our own pre-modern variant at the time called Hyper Extended, which is Fallen Empires through Scourge with no core sets.
That's a really funny name, by the way. That's so good.
That became the dominant way that we were playing, at least with our local scene. And we convinced stores to support it and run it, and we were running 20, 25 person weeklies of this format that only we were playing. But for a time, that was interesting, right? We were not necessarily pleased with the way that WotC was managing the formats, and so we kind of took it into our own hands to kind of build our own constructed formats. And so I think that's a neat little way that the game has legs. And so even with 30 years of history, right, it can keep evolving and kind of live on.
It's funny that to me that's like an extension of the kitchen table ethos to Magic, but on the other side of it, where there's kind of this line down the middle of how the game is, I don't know, expected or marketed to be played. But you can either go a very casual route one direction, or like, oh well, no, we will officialize our own set of legality and rules on the other to make it something different.
Yeah, and I to me that was like the first kitchen table experience I really had, because I started playing the game in stores, and I only played sanctioned formats for a number of years, and so it's I think what most people start at, with the kitchen table kind of stuff, and it's where I'm ending up, which is interesting to see. Just the path I took was that I couldn't afford really to play constructed, and so I played a lot of limited because it was the cheaper alternative. And then once I could afford, I started to wedge my way in. And now we're getting to a point where I think part of it is everyone has their own biases, and you like the time that you came into the game and you like your history, but I've been playing for a number of years now, and the game's just not the same as maybe I would have liked it to be. And so we go back into our own ways, and we build our own formats, and we build our own experiences. And I think Cube kind of allows you to curate whatever you want to play, which is the best way to do it. And so now I'm back at limited again.
I love it.
And I don't necessarily mean to say that the game is in a bad state now, or this is not good gameplay, right? And
Oh no,
it's just
certainly
that
not. Right.
it's not what I was familiar with, right? We all have our own foggy glasses towards the period that we enjoyed.
Yeah, I found that that's a tricky thing to do, to say that there are elements about the game that each of us are going to enjoy, and that may look different than what people are experiencing, like coming into the game now. That's going to look very different from where we began,
Yeah.
and that is okay.
And when I was a bright-eyed child and it was all fresh and new to me, it was exciting. And there were things that you enjoyed because they were new, and they were experiences that you had, and they were the first time you had played a certain play pattern, or the first time you had seen a certain interaction. And so to me, those will always kind of be memories. And I think we're just at a point in our lives now where I don't really enjoy the types of games that I would play at a store in a standard environment. And so we kind of seek what we want.
And it sounds like the Kuleshov Cube is a way to encapsulate some of that, or to capture a different speed of the game or a different type of game.
Yeah, I hope so. And for me, it's been a good way to kind of recontextualize new sets and find stuff that I'm interested in, so that I don't have to look exclusively at the most powerful cards, or what's going to be relevant for standard or legacy, for example. And so, we can digest Magic at our own pace. I don't need to look at every set. I can look at it twice a year. It's the Cube experience where you can kind of pick and choose your own part of the buffet.
Well, Brendan, as you think about what you've put together with the Kuleshov Cube, or with your Peasant Cube, with the other projects you're working on, what advice would you consider sharing with other designers on their step of the journey?
Well, one would be, don't listen to me. I don't think I have, I guess, the background kind of to come promote that. No, but I mean, firstly, I think what I try and do is build for my own personal beliefs and what I kind of want to play. And then also for what my audience is, and kind of knowing my audience is pretty crucial. And my audience tends to be people that have more or less retired from constructed gameplays, and people that might only play a couple times a year. And so, when I go to a bar or hotel event on an annual basis, I want to be able to present them with something they can approach and actually enjoy. Don't let your audience dictate what they want to see, but I think you need to kind of keep them in mind, and make sure you're building experiences that they will internalize and accept.
I love it. Well, as we are trending toward wrapping up here, I get to ask one of my favorite questions, which is, Brendan, if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would it be, and who would you have do the illustration?
I knew you were going to ask this one because I did do my research on this. And the problem I have is that I personally don't include alternate art, alternate frame, alternate printing. So I'm
Right.
generally not the right person to kind of go with that kind of approach. So if I was to answer this question, I'd really prefer like a new card to be printed, right? That would kind of fill a slot that I need, or a kind of a role that I want to play. If you could give me a good stable, one drop red card, one drop creature for my Peasant Cube, I'd love it, because that's been a revolving door the last couple of years.
Don't worry, Ragavan will get downshifted before too long.
Oh, jeez. What ours, though, I'd really like to see the return of John Howe. He did some work in the early 2000s, and his final illustration was an Eventide, actually. but he hasn't really interacted with the game since then. You might be most familiar with his cards from Invasion, like Opt or the Dodecapod, but Howe has a lot of history with Lord of the Rings, both the books, the Peter Jackson movies, both the original and the Hobbit movies. He's also involved with Rings of Power and kind of does all the concept art for Lord of the Rings currently. And he just has a really great style. I think it's a very bold 2000s Magic indicative style that you kind of don't see a lot. If I could, rewrite history instead of a reprint, I'd love if he did maybe Greenbelt Guardian, but as a Kavu.
Okay. Okay.
He did two Kavus originally back in the 2000s. I think it would just be a great fit if we could rewrite history.
No, Brendan, I like this twist. The theme is that people generally don't answer this question exactly as I expect, and that seems like a good way to do it.
I was trying to struggle and find if there was a promo or a reprint that I would like, and the problem I have is that there are art I might not think is great, but in general, I think I identify at least with whatever the original printing of the card is, and
Yeah.
if it's good or bad, that's okay. It's just it is what it is. And so, with the exception of some new stuff that maybe I don't want a car on it or I don't want a cowboy hat, it's not going to bother me. It's totally okay.
Well, Brendan, this has been a pleasure, and I'm so grateful for your time. And it's been a thrill to hear about your journey along the way. So thank you for taking the time to share with us. If folks want to explore more about what you're working on, where would be the best place for us to point them?
Absolutely. I'm Hagen BMJ on most socials, which is just my last name and initials. On Blue Sky, though, I'm at grizzlebrand.com.
That's so good.
With the Grizzlebrand domain there. So if you want to hit me up there, that's fine. But go ahead and look for my cubes. As I mentioned, Kuleshov is going to be at Capital CubeCon later this year. That's September. And then with any luck, it'll be at CubeCon as well. It's currently in the round 2 voting, whatever it's called, having just missed on the first round of voting. And by tomorrow, as the time of recording this, we'll know if the Peasant Cube makes it as well.
Well, certainly all the best. I know those are big opportunities for sure.
Yeah, it'll be fun, just to kind of share with everyone else.
Well, thank you again so much for being part of this and your time and your passion. It's really been a treat, and I'm hopeful for the future of these projects. Hope you get to share them with many others, and hope there are more opportunities to connect in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Cade. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.